So chapter 3 talks about how we control the exercising muscle. There's two different ways that your body sends signals. One is through electricity, and that's what we're going to talk about with this chapter. And then the next chapter talks about hormones. But this chapter is going to talk all about how your body distributes electricity to your working muscles. And the way that's going to do that is down these neurons, right? And neurons are going to be the distribution mechanism by which electricity is shuttled through the body. One interesting thing about control through electricity is that it's much faster to get signals down neurons using electricity than it is to get signals through the body using hormones. Hormones are molecules, or they're substrates in the body that are used to send messages, but mostly through the blood. So that takes a lot longer for that to occur. So neurological information is much faster spread through electricity than it is through hormones. So that's a good thing. This chapter will start with an overview of nerves and the nervous system, but the nervous system is bigger than just your nerves that innervate your muscles. There's your central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. Then there are nerves that are controlling voluntary movements, and there are nerves that are controlling involuntary movements like sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Then the chapter will talk about how the nervous system specifically interacts with the muscles, and it'll break down both of those areas of the central nervous system, the central and peripheral nervous system, and then the sensory motor integration. So that's just an outline of the chapter. The major divisions of the nervous system are here: the central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord. And remember, the brain uses glucose for its fuel, so we want to be able to provide sugars to the brain. Anybody ever think about why most of the foods that you eat for breakfast are all carbohydrate? Like bagels, pancakes, syrup, waffles, fruit, cereal, oatmeal, all it is carbohydrate. It's because when you're sleeping, the brain isn't dead. The brain is still functioning, and it's using all of the excess sugars that are kind of in the brain. So you wake up and your brain is kind of exhausted of carbohydrate, and now you need to replenish that. So got to keep the brain and the spinal cord healthy. The peripheral nervous system are the nerves that are innervating the arms and the legs, the periphery. They're innervating the appendages, fingers. I'm going to get Claudia in. Now, this slide right here is almost implying a different kind of motor control. In the beginning, what we talked about is hierarchical motor programming, where the brain controls the entire body, right? The brain is like the top of this marionette here, where you have this like sticks, and you have the strings that come down from the marionette, and then they control the little body, right? Like, so that's hierarchical motor programming theory, that the brain here, the top of the body, controls everything below it. Then we've also talked about other motor programming theories, like the theory that the brain controls the body. There's another theory that I even spoke about, we call dynamic systems theory. All right, these are competing ways of thinking how the body is controlled, how the motor aspects of the body are controlled. So you have dynamic systems theory, you have hierarchical motor programming theory, but this is a little bit of a different, whoopsies, this is a little bit of a different motor programming theory that they're implying with this slide here. It's called a closed loop motor programming theory, closed loop. And the reason why it's called closed loop is because you have these nerves that are acting as an information or a feedback system. So you have these neurons that are called efferent neurons. And those neurons go from the brain down to the body. And they send information from the brain to the arms, to the legs and such. And then you have other neurons that are afferent. So these are afferent neurons. And those neurons are going from the body to the brain. And the brain is sending information down to the muscles. And then through things like Golgi tendon organs and proprioception and muscle spindles and baroreceptors and all these receptors in your skin and stuff, there's information going up to the brain. So there's efferent information going away from the brain, and then there's afferent information going up to the brain, and it closes this loop of feedback, of information. And this is called a closed loop motor programming theory. Now, the way that you can remember afferent versus efferent nerves is the A in the afferent points upward. And you know, because of that, that those are the neurons that are traveling upward to the brain, giving kind of like biofeedback or position data. And then the efferent nerves, they kind of like have a backbone, and then the nerves kind of branch out to the rest of the body. So that would be an efferent nerve. Information from the brain to the body and then back again, closing the loop of information. And this is potentially a good model of motor control as compared to the hierarchical motor programming theory. And so now these afferent and efferent nerves are going to leave the brain and potentially cause contractions, muscle contractions, and they're going to result in these somatic, or these movements of my muscles that I'm aware of, or that I'm trying to make voluntary. Now, we had a conversation last week about what voluntary is and whether or not voluntary is actually voluntary, or are there parts of voluntary movements that can have automatic aspects to them, or kind of like instinctual aspects? Yes. So the definition voluntary and involuntary is somewhat in question, but for right now, somatic nerves are nerves that allow us to have voluntary movement and innervate the skeletal muscles. But then there's the autonomic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system is going to control things that are not voluntary, like heart rate, breathing rate, vasodilation and constriction of blood vessels, the breakdown of fats, lipids, proteins for fuel. And the way that you can think about this parasympathetic or sympathetic, and which one is which, the sympathetic nervous system, and actually I'll start with the parasympathetic. The parasympathetic, the P goes like this. And then this part of the P, to me, points downwards. So I know that the parasympathetic makes everything go down. So the sympathetic nervous system is the flight or fight. Like, it's preparing you to run or to protect yourself. And because you're going to either fight or flight, you're going to need to utilize food and energy. So it's flight and fight, and it's utilizing energy, using energy. So anything that's going to make you digest carbohydrate faster, All right. So fight or flight and using energy. It's fight and what was it? It was flight. It was rest. All right. This one is rest and digest. So the parasympathetic is the opposite. It's rest and digest. So that's how you can remember I guess the difference between the two. So the parasympathetic nervous system is getting you ready to store energy, is getting you ready to calm down, calm your heart rate, calm your blood pressure, you know. So those are the difference between the two. Sympathetic nervous system, increase heart rate, increase vasodilation, increase the shuttling of carbohydrates to your muscles to use for fuel, and parasympathetic is the opposite, kind of like a shutdown. So you have information coming from the central nervous system down to the peripheral nervous system through effector or efferent nerves, nerves that are affecting other parts of the body. And these efferent nerves are either going to be somatic, and these are the types of nerves that are going to result in voluntary movements, muscle contractions. And then you have your auto or your autonomic nerves that are going to allow for your physiological functioning, heart rate, blood pressure, breathing rate, shuttling food in and out of cells, changing from carbohydrate to fat and protein for fuel. All right, so this information is coming down from the brain, all the arrows down, down, down. But you also have these afferent nerves that are moving information up to the brain. Again, a closed loop motor program theory here. These afferent nerves are things like Golgi tendon organs, muscle spindles, baro and chemoreceptors, pain receptors, proprioceptive information coming from your joints and such. And most of this information is going to be distributed or transmitted by neurons. And we've all studied probably the function or the anatomy of a neuron. All right, every neuron is going to have a cell body. And attached to that cell body, there's going to be a number of dendrites. And those dendrites are where neurons or the axons of other neurons can attach. So none you'll have this axon, which is a long kind of organization of neuron cells that is able to propagate the action potential from the cell body down the axon, and eventually it gets to its axon terminals, the end of the axon. And then on each of these axons, there's going to be this stuff called myelin, and it's going to protect the axon, and it also increases the rate at which the action potential can travel down the axons. And if we have time at the end of the day, I'll show you a quick video about the deterioration of these myelin sheaths and what happens when they are deteriorated and what you can do to kind of thwart their deterioration. I didn't know that we could improve our neurological functioning through food and stuff like that, but you can. So other neurons are attached to these dendrites. If the action potential coming in from these, or if the voltage, the electrical voltage coming into these dendrites is high enough, it will make another action potential fire from this cell body down through the axon and eventually into the axon terminals. And then potentially these would be attached to muscle fibers, or they would be attached to dendrites of another neuron and propagate the electrical potential to to the next cell. So the cell body contains the nucleus. There's going to be a nucleus in there somewhere. And then these dendrites here are receiver cells, and they're picking up information from neighboring and attached neurons. And they're going to carry the impulse, the electrical impulse, which is the action potential, toward the cell body. So the dendrites are going to receive the action potential. Now, if the action potential is a very, very low electrical signal, then nothing's going to happen. But if the action potential is a high enough electrical voltage, then this cell body will propagate the action potential and cause the action potential to go down the rest of the cell. These axon terminals, the end terminals, are where your neurotransmitters, acetylcholine and dopamine, are going to be released and either allow for them to go to that action potential to go to the muscle fiber itself and allow for calcium to be released, or it's just going to go to another cell body. And what the brain uses is an electrical signal. And there's a stimulus that's creating this electrical signal. And that electrical signal has to go down the axon, and it has to be transmitted to either the next cell in line, or it's going to be transmitted to the muscle fiber that it's attaching to. Now, an interesting question is, where does this stimulus get generated? So yeah, I might have an idea. Or yeah, I want to pick up my phone, right? I want to pick up my phone. So that's a stimulus. Obviously, there was a stimulus that was generated so that I could actually have an action potential and pick up my phone. But like, where did the stimulus come from? Like, did it come from the phone being down on the table and me having a plan to pick it up? Did the stimulus come from my mind? Did it come from my soul? Did it come from, I'm not 100% sure, but this electrical signal is generated by a stimulus. So the stimulus could be vision, it could be sound waves, it could be touch, it could be, there's no real answer how the stimulus is generated or where that electrical signal actually like comes from. But once it's there, that electrical signal travels down the axon and is transmitted to the next cell in line. This line right here is another example of why we have to kind of look into this whole, the brain does it kind of organization of our body, because we still don't know how the brain does that, or where that stimulus is generated by. Like, is it generated here in the brain? Is it generated here? Is it generated in the brainstem? Like, and how does the brain, which is just a big lump of neurons, how does the brain do that? So that's a big sticking point of this hierarchical motor programming theory. And it's not going to propagate any electrical signal unless the electrical signal is actually strong enough. Like, I have like a 60-watt light bulb in my ceiling. And if I only put 3 watts into that light bulb, it's just not enough electricity to light the bulb. So there are electrical signals going through your body all the time. Why aren't you like having dyskinesia or hyper movements or twitching all the time? Well, I mean, sometimes you are, but it's because the signal isn't strong enough to propagate or to travel down the axon. And that's good, because if even the lightest or the very smallest change in electrical potential would result in a movement, then you would like have all these twitches and unnecessary movements all day, every day. In fact, unless the change in electrical difference outside and inside of a cell is more than 70 millivolts, there won't be really any action potential at all. Now, the reason or the way that this action potential travels down the axon is by these charged ions. And you have potassium and sodium And sodium, Na is a plus ion, Na plus, and potassium is a negatively charged ion. And that means that there's a polarization. There's on the inside of the cell wall here, there's a positive charge, and on the outside, there's a negative charge. That means it's polarized. And that polarization, the switching between opening ion channels, sodium ion channels, and potassium ion channels, so that sodium can rush into the cell and potassium can rush out of the cell, it changes the electrical charges on the inside and the outside of the cell. And that actually propagates the electrical action potential. But the difference between the inside and the outside of the cell in terms of their voltage has to be more than 70 millivolts. So in the beginning, there is a large amount of sodium outside the cell, which means that outside of the cell has a pretty large positive charge. But there's a less, it's not a negative charge that's inside the cell, it's just less positive. Okay, because they're both positive ions. But you can say there's a high concentration of sodium outside of the cell, and there's just a little bit of potassium inside the cell. Now, what wants to happen is sodium wants to enter the cell, but it's not able to get through these sodium channels. And what also happens is the potassium eventually wants to leave the cell. Now, I'm not going to ask you all of these little nuances of how this happens and go step by step. But really what it is it's just a change in the concentration of sodium and potassium along this axon. But then, like, you could imagine, like, if I could blow this up, right? If you could blow, whoops, I can't blow that up. And I won't try it then. What this myelin does, so you could imagine that if you have these sodium potassium ion channels that run along the entire length of this axon, and for an action potential to go from here to here to here to here to here, all of these sodium and potassium changes in gradient outside the cell and inside the cell have to happen all along the entire length of this axon. But what myelin does, these sheaths here, they make it so that the sodium and potassium ion channels have to switch back and forth up until the myelin, but then the myelin acts as this bridge. So once the sodium ion channel here opens, and then there's the rush of potassium outside the cell, the action potential actually jumps from this side of the myelin sheath to this side. And then the sodium ion channels have to open and close between the next myelin sheath. But when it gets to here, it jumps back down to the next open spot on the axon that isn't covered by myelin. So rather than the action potential having to switch sodium and potassium ion gradients and open these channels all the way down the axon, it actually skips over the myelin, skips over the myelin. And what the myelin does is it increases the speed at which the action potential can travel down the axons and get to the terminal branches. Now, if this myelin wasn't here, then the sodium and potassium ion channels would have to open and close along the entire length of each of the axons, multiply that by all of the axons that you have in your central nervous system. And now it takes a huge amount of time for this action potential to get to where it needs to go. But with this myelin sheaths here, what it does is it cuts down the propagation time and makes it so that the action potentials travel much faster. So at first, your cells are depolarized. And then eventually, one second. And eventually, clear this. So you have some action potentials that are very small. They can send a signal to one neuron, but because the action potential is not high enough, it remains a graded potential. It's just a little bit of electricity going in and out of cells, but it's not enough energy for an axon or for that action potential to really excite the cell body and make for a real excitatory movement down in terms of the action potential down the axon. But if there is enough of a depolarization or a change in the sodium and potassium from inside to outside of the cell, then there will be a strong enough action potential, and that will potentially propagate a signal from the brain to the central nervous system. All right, but most action potentials begin as these graded potentials or not strong enough to actually do anything signal. All right, let's get rid of some of this stuff. So let's say a graded potential has a millivolt change of less than 70 millivolts. Nothing's going to happen. No action potential will occur, and therefore they refer to it as the all or none principle. If there is an actual change in potential that's higher than 70 millivolts, then there will be an influx of sodium into the cell. It will change the polarization, and then there'll be another exit of potassium outside of the cell. So there's this kind of like wave of electricity going on with the influx and the efflux of sodium and potassium in and out of the cell. And if this happens to an extent that allows for that electrical signal to increase, all of a sudden, if there's a 70 millivolt change, then the entire action potential will propagate. Let's see what we got here. All right. So after there's a polarization, after that 70 millivolt change, there's a depolarization. And so like the sodium and potassium are being sucked in and out of the cell, all right? And when they're sucked out of the cell, there's a change in action potential, but then they have to enter the cell and get pulled back out. And now when the sodium and potassium are entering their original state, it's a depolarization, and the neuron cannot respond to another stimulus until there's a repolarization or a change in the sodium and potassium ion channels. They're opening and closing and opening and closing. When they're open, the action potential can travel through. When they're closed, they can't have an action potential. All right, so what the myelin does is it speeds up this particular process. All right, it makes it so that these little cells here, these fatty sheaths called Schwann cells, all right, the action potential skips over the Schwann cells. These are nodes here called the nodes of Ranvier. All right, now when you have multiple sclerosis, which is something that I'll show you a video of later on, there's a degeneration of this myelin. And what that's going to do is it's going to disrupt how the action potential travels. It's going to make it so that some of the myelin is available so that the action potential can skip, but then there's some myelin that's not available. So what it does is it disrupts the timing of all of these signals being sent to the body. Sometimes the timing will be too strong. I mean, will take too long to propagate. And if I'm trying to like grab something, or if I'm trying to like brake pedal, or I'm trying to walk, and the signals, the action potentials, are taking too long to propagate down the axon because my myelin sheaths are starting to deteriorate. I mean, now I'm going to have dyskinetic movements and all sorts of issues in terms of my voluntary muscle contractions. Eventually, the action potential is going to travel all the way down this axon, all the way to the gaps between your neurons and your site of communication, which is called a synapse. So the action potential is going to have to jump across the border between this axon terminal and the muscle fiber. And that's going to be, or another neuron. That's going to be a synapse, or the junction between a neuron and another neuron. That's where these dendrites come in. Now let's go take a look over here. So in the end of these axon terminals, you have your neuromuscular transmitters, and they're housed in these vesicles. And if the electric potential is high enough, then what's going to happen is the acetylcholine, or the neurotransmitter, is going to be released from the synaptic vessels, and it's going to be attached to this postsynaptic receptor. So on the postsynaptic side, there are going to be receptors for each of these neuromuscular transmitters. Some of these neuromuscular transmitters are going to be acetylcholine, and some is going to be dopamine. Acetylcholine is going to travel across this edge, and it's going to make the action potential propagate in this tissue, because these tissues are also going to have some of those sodium and potassium ion channels that can help move the action potential. So these neurotransmitters are chemical messengers, and they're going to help bring that action potential across the synaptic cleft. And eventually they're going to either stimulate another graded potential, or eventually an action potential in the neuron or the muscle that's after the synapse. So this site between the neuron and the muscle is connected by these neurotransmitters, in this case acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is excitatory. It means that it helps pass the action potential to the muscle. Dopamine is the opposite. It's an inhibitory. So it's going to stop the action potential. That's why somebody who has Parkinson's disease, who doesn't have a lot of dopamine, has tight muscles and tremors, because there's too much acetylcholine going past that synaptic cleft. So when somebody has Parkinson's disease, what you give them is levodopa. Levodopa is synthetic dopamine. They can plug synthetic dopamine into the blood, into the muscles, and then what will happen is it will withdraw some of that acetylcholine. Now, the acetylcholine gets to the end of that postsynaptic cleft and causes the same kind of electrical change that happened in the motor neuron with the potassium and the sodium. Now, if that depolarization is just a little bit, then it's not going to create an action potential. It'll stay as a graded potential. But if the depolarization, again, is higher than negative 70 millivolts or 70 millivolts, then the action potential is going to be strong enough. That's going to go down the sarcoplasmic, down the T tubules, and it will result in the release of calcium, which is going to result in the release of troponin and tropomyosin, so that you can have a muscle contraction. Let's see. Now, dopamine and acetylcholine are not the only neurotransmitters, but they are the main neurotransmitters that you'll study about, really. I don't really talk too much about this stuff here. I don't necessarily think you need to go into the different kinds of neurotransmitters or whatever. But I think that acetylcholine and dopamine are the most important ones that you would hear of. All right. And again, acetylcholine is excitatory and it helps the skeletal muscle contract. And it also helps to mediate your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, which we're going to start talking about pretty much right now. So then the chapter starts talking about the different parts of the brain and the different areas of the brain. And I mean, this is not necessarily a neural anatomy course, so I'm not going to ask all of these minutia detail of what the cerebrum does, what the diencephalon. There's only 4 things that are mentioned, so you should probably know at least what their major functions are. So the brain has 2 hemispheres, the left and right hemisphere. And the left and right hemisphere communicates with each other through a bunch of thick nerves called your corpus callosum. The outer layer of the brain is called your cerebral cortex. And the inner layer is non-myelinated. Now we know what that means, and it's gray in color, so it's called gray matter. Now, I don't understand what this is, this conscious brain or the mind. I don't know where that is. Now all of a sudden you get into theoretical stuff, but the book is mostly presenting facts. And here's slides of muscle cells, and everything is like really definitive. But then all of a sudden they use this word mind, right? Now they're going back and forth from scientific-based book that I'm teaching you, and now they're going into kind of theoretical stuff. I don't know where this conscious brain is, or I'm not 100% sure about that, but apparently all of these conscious voluntary movements come from our cerebral cortex. There are 5 lobes of your cerebrum. There's the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe is where motor control or voluntary movement is initiated. There's your temporal lobe. There's your parietal lobe. There's your occipital lobe. Your occipital lobe is in the back of your head. If you fall down and you bang your head and you get super dizzy and like out of like oriented, then it's because your vision, your visual centers are in the back of your head. If you take your hand and just go like that in the back of your head, you can even see like your eyes kind of get like jostled a little bit. Or you take a back massager and you put it on your neck, and then you watch TV and you see all of like the TV is like wobbling and stuff. It's because that vibration is directly innervating your occipital lobe and affecting your vision. And then you also have a deep lobe of the brain, and it could be the case that that's where your basal ganglia are. I mean, I don't know if they call it the deep lobe or whatever, but there's another part of the brain that's pretty deep. All right, your primary motor cortex or your frontal lobe is where your conscious movements occur. And in your basal ganglia here is where your control of repetitive motions is. Repetitive things that you do over and over, like chewing. You do the same thing over and over and over and over and over. And walking is the same thing. It has a pattern to it. Running has a pattern to it. And what the basal ganglia does is it kind of like gives you like a click track for those patterns. You know, but if I'm a musician and I don't have a click track and I go to record music, it's going to sound all messy, and I get out of I guess synchrony or tempo or timing. The basal ganglia helps create this inner timing. And with people who have Parkinson's disease, quiet down, Doug. With people who have Parkinson's disease, this basal ganglia is deteriorating, so they really don't have this inner tempo to keep these repetitive motions effectively moving forward. And that's where a lot of like the dyskinetic movements. Now, along with the fact that the basal ganglia creates dopamine, and if they don't have enough dopamine, and the basal ganglia is in charge of not only the dopamine production, but also this inner tempo then all of a sudden there's this potential for uncontrolled and non-synchronized movements and such. So when the basal ganglia starts to become deteriorated and it makes it so that there's less dopamine, then one of the ways that you can determine whether or not somebody has Parkinson's disease is to give them dopamine therapy. And if they behave, or if their behavior, not behavior, but if their movements change for the better because of the dopamine therapy, that is one indicator that an individual might have Parkinson's disease. There's other parts of your brain that are not necessarily involved with sending out action potentials. The thalamus is where most of your sensory information is going to enter the brain. So your visual, hearing, a lot of your proprioceptive, Golgi tendon, muscle spindles, all of that afferent information that's coming from your periphery up to the brain, all of that stuff is coming into the thalamus. And that's going to determine what we're consciously aware of. I have no idea how a thalamus can determine consciousness. That's another one, like a phrase that's kind of interesting. Really, how does it determine what we're consciously aware of? It feels to me like the determination of consciousness is like an emergent property, kind of like length comes out of nowhere. Seems like consciousness comes out of nowhere. But this slide is saying that the thalamus is determining consciousness. Now, I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think that the thalamus is a relay center for a lot of these senses. It's a relay center for, for proprioception and for chemoreceptors and baroreceptors. And when all of that information is kind of like triangulated or used together, and you make a system of all of these senses, you make a system out of the senses, then what is awareness is the emergent property of each of these systems working together. The awareness emerges. The awareness is not determined by the thalamus. Now, the thalamus is a relay center for all of the senses. But remember, the senses are all just waves. They're like sound waves, light waves. They're all the same kind of sensation, or they're the same type of information. And all of these senses working together, relaying that information to the thalamus, what emerges is consciousness. But I don't know if the thalamus is constantly working on finding out what's conscious and what's not conscious. Hypothalamus is a smaller portion of, or a smaller, I guess, thalamus, you could think of it. And what that's doing is it's kind of like your thermostat in your house. And it's trying to maintain a neutral or a steady environment. So there are, and then one interesting thing about the hypothalamus is that the hypothalamus is involved in not only neurons, but it's also involved with hormones. So now we're going even more complicated. You have your endocrine system, right? Your hormones, and you have your nervous system, right? And again, they call it the endocrine and the nervous. And just like dynamic systems, it's the endocrine system and the nervous system. And these are two systems that have emergent properties of their own. But now the hypothalamus is a system between the neurons and the hormones. Right? It's like even more complicated, another layer of complication in the system, but that's kind of a good thing because, like I said before, every system has emergent properties. So the emergent property of the neurological system is maybe the action potential, and the emergent property of the endocrine system is our response to hormones. what is the emergent property of both of these systems now intertwining and making it into one, like kind of like nested, more complicated system? What is the emergent property of that system? I can't tell you, but it's got to be pretty awesome. It's got to be pretty functional and usable, and like the same thing between the emergent property of the musculoskeletal system is pretty astounding. Now, appetite suppression, food intake, thirst and balance and sleep, blood pressure, all of that. I don't think that the hypothalamus itself is organizing all of this stuff. It's too much. The hypothalamus is just a small piece of the brain, and it's responsible for all of this: appetite, hunger, intake, balance, thirst, food, sleep, blood pressure, breathing, body temperature. It's too difficult for me to think that the hypothalamus is the only thing that's doing all of this. But it is easier for me to think that the hypothalamus is an amazing system created by neurons that are through tissues interacting with hormones. And what emerges from this system here is all of this stuff. That's easier for me to think of than thinking that the thalamus itself is doing all of this. Because if I put the thalamus on a table, the thalamus isn't going to do anything. You know what I mean? The thalamus is only doing something within the restraints of all of the other systems and chemicals and electrical potentials and graded potentials. It's all this one big nested system. So for me to think of the control of each one of these things emerging because of the unique structuring of these systems, that's fine for me to understand. But if you tell me the hypothalamus and the hypothalamus itself does all of this stuff, it's hard for me to think, because I was never even aware of my hypothalamus. I never felt my hypothalamus thinking, or I never thought my hypothalamus was doing this stuff actively. It seems to just come out of nowhere. But all of these things, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, all of the things that we're going to talk about, they're not working independently of each other. They're working with each other. And what emerges from all of these particular systems of the brain working together, what emerges is the control of the human body. That's where dynamic systems theory would say, right? Because right now, the cerebellum is going to control rapid, complex movements. All right. Interesting. I'm going to do a movement. Look at my screen, right? I'm going to do a movement right now. I've never done it before in my life. I did it perfect. Like, I never thought of it. I could never do that motion again. My facial gesticulations, I could never do that again. And I did it rapidly, and I tried to make it complex. And there was like a weird timing between my hands and everything. And when I finished boom, with perfect timing. But I don't think that that was a cognitive movement. I don't think it's it was just something that I did. So how could my cerebellum control this rapid movement that was pretty complex? And how could it do it with a movement that was completely and totally random? It could never have compared what I did to an actual or intended movement, because the movement that I did was, I had no like thought to it. It was totally random. I had no idea where my body positions were going to go from 1 second to the next. My muscle status was just all over the place. So if the cerebellum is controlling these complex movements, how did it control what I did? Because what I did was completely and totally random. But how does something control something that's random? I think that a different way of thinking where my movement came from was right now I'm in the midst of a discussion, and a discussion is a system. You're using words to connect to a class. And in that very system, these topics are coming up. The topics themselves are all emergent. And in order for me to explain the topic to you without completely writing every line that I write and deliver in my lectures, the lecture itself is an emergent thing. Like I have no idea how my brain is telling me all of these little nuances of each slide. I just let it come out. So I think that these rapid, complex movements that demonstrate amazing timing and sequencing, when I cannot compare to an intended movement, I think the body positions that I made emerged, as opposed to the cerebellum being the thing that controls rapid and complex movements. But the very nature of the book that I'm using to teach you, all right, implies hierarchical motor programming theory. That's what that phrase says. The cerebellum controls rapid, complex movements. If that's not a top-down theory, where the cerebellum here, the thing at the top, is controlling all the things at the bottom, if this is not a top-down theory, then I don't know what is. Right? So the book is written according to hierarchical motor programming theory. And if you buy into it, fine. But if you buy into it, eventually somebody is going to come up to you and they're going to say, hey, how does my body control rapid, complex movements? Well, I mean, the only answer we can give up to right now is, well, that's what the cerebellum does. The cerebellum does it. Oh, well, how does it do it? How does it coordinate the timing between, I'm going to do a 360 dunk. My whole body is working. How does the cerebellum control the timing of that movement? Or like when Flips is running down the field as a cornerback, he doesn't know where the other player is running. So how could his cerebellum coordinate the sequence of movements so that he can do something intended? And Flips is diving through the air. Flips, I don't know if you saw that Oklahoma-Nebraska game and that dude who had that interception. There's no possible way. Did you see that, by the way, Flips?
Yeah, I saw it.
Dude, how could that guy have run down the field and accounted for that body position? You know what I mean? Like no person in the history of man has ever caught a football like that before. So this is all of a sudden, I'm starting to get my doctorate and I'm reading stuff like this. And I went into my professors. I was like, hey, I read this slide and it said that the cerebellum controls rapid, complex movements and timing and everything and compares it to an intended movement. But like that guy on the football field, there's no possible way that this happened. That catch happened. It emerged because of where the players were. It emerged because of where the ball was thrown and the speed of the ball. It emerged because you have all of these systems, gravity, the field, the game, the other players running, and it's too complex for the brain to be able to calculate, all right, my opponent is moving 15 miles an hour. I must jump 8 feet in the air, change my body angle to 6 degrees pitch, 9 degrees yaw, 3 degrees roll, separate my hand. It's just impossible. It's impossible for the brain to control all of that. And if your theory of motor control is that the brain is doing it, fine. But now you're going to have to explain how the cerebellum is controlling Flips when he's running down the field. And Flips isn't thinking about anything aside from get the ball, make my teammates happy. We have to win. He's not thinking about the other stuff. Right? Here's the next slide, the brainstem. The brainstem relays information between the brain and the spinal cord. That makes relative sense, right? But it's also saying that the brainstem actually has some functional role, like the brainstem, like a janitor is sweeping up stuff, like he's doing something. The brainstem is just a bunch of tissues. Now, the brainstem will help relay information between the brain and the spinal cord, but I don't think that the brainstem is like the operator in one of those old things, you know, like, hello, operator, yeah, I like, and then they click the information here. It's not an active role that the brainstem has, it's a passive role. It helps relay information between the brain and the spinal cord. But this thing here, this is giving a function to the cerebellum. This is giving a function, the thalamus. This is an action term. Like if I gave you guys learning objectives at the beginning of the chapter, it would say, I would like for Alice to be able to determine this, for Alexander to be able to do this, give an action, but it's giving an action to determine something, and they're giving this action to a piece of the brain. It's another way of thinking about that. I don't know if anybody's heard of Rene Descartes, but he talked about like the body being like a machine, where you have the computer, and then you have the heart, which is a pump, and then you have the lungs, which are the bellows. And you try to like break down the body into these different like parts of a machine. And you say that this heart does that, the lungs do this, the brain does this. And then you take probes and stick them into the brain and see what parts of the brain do these particular things. But this is a very mechanistic view of what the body does. What it's doing is it's giving a function for each of these particular things. It says this primary motor cortex is in charge of conscious control. Really? I've never been aware of it. The basal ganglia helps initiate repetitive movements. Really? No. Does the basal ganglia initiate sustained or repetitive movements, or does it make it so there's there's dopamine, and indirectly the dopamine working with the action potentials? And that's more of a systems approach of kind of thinking how everything is. But each one, it says the brainstem is relaying information. The reticular formation, that's the thing that is solely responsible for coordination of skeletal muscle. Hard to think of that stuff. In any event, this is what the brain looks like. This is the frontal lobe. This is where your conscious control of movement, at least this book is telling you it's from. This is your parietal lobe, occipital lobe. The way I remember it is F is in the front, and then P-O-T, F, and then POT. Parietal lobe at the top, occipital lobe in the back, temporal lobe in the middle, and then here's where your midbrain, your pons, your medulla, your basal ganglia, all that. Now your spinal cord has its afferent or sensory fibers and efferent motor fibers. Remember, your afferent nerves are sending information upwards, and your efferent nerves are sending information downwards. So a better way to draw it is just your afferent nerves are going upwards, and your efferent nerves are going from your brain to your body. And there's this closed loop of information where you have information coming from the brain, and then you have like feedback information, and it closes this whole loop. That's another theory of motor control called your closed loop motor programming theory. Again, there are so many different motor control theories out there that you're going to have to buy into one. Right? Hierarchical motor programming, dynamic systems theory, closed loop. There's open loop. There's an open loop chain where it's open loop motor programming theory says the brain sends a signal to the body. It's very similar to saying hierarchical motor programming theory. There's another theory of motor control And the theory of motor control is called God. God has everything predetermined for us. We don't have the brain, the spinal cord, none of that's happening. God is doing everything for us. There's another theory of motor control called fate, right? Where fate is controlling all of everything. There's another theory of motor control called instinct, where we don't have any real thought of movements, or it's just we're instinctual beings that are living and dying so that we can get food. That's pretty much it. Now, these are competitive theories of motor control that compete against closed loop and open loop and hierarchy. Which one do you buy into? But over and over and over, the book keeps pumping this hierarchical motor programming theory. It even starts with the top of the body. It starts with the top of the brain, right? Starts with the top, the brain, and it goes down to the spinal cord. And it's literally going top down, describing the body top down. Now, the peripheral nervous system is the periphery. It's the nerves in the arms and the legs. There's your sensory nerves and your afferent nerves. Your sensory nerves are transmitting information from the periphery to the brain. So some of the sensors that you have are in your skin, in your joints. Okay, mechanical receptors, they're sensing physical forces. So you have mechanical sensors in your skin, in your hands. And like if I push on you, all right, the skin stretches, and they're like little strain gauges that sends information back to the brain. You have thermoreceptors. If you put your hands on a hot stove, right, it'll send information not necessarily to the brain, but it'll send information to either the spinal cord or to the brain. You have nociceptors, you have photoreceptors, chemoreceptors. You have other sensors like kinesthetic sensors. Like if you close your eyes, you can put your arms out like a letter T with your arms horizontal, even if you're not looking at them, because you have sensors in your muscles that are sending information back to your brain. So you have an awareness of where you are in space. That's what kinesthesia is. You have muscle spindles. Muscle spindles are in your muscles, and you guys have all experienced a muscle spindle before, right? You're at the doctor, and the doctor is going to take that little prick, and he's going to take the little hammer, and he's going to bang you in the knee right there. And then what happens to your foot is your foot swings, right? It's because your body is like kind of like this here. You have your quads, and your quads are attached to your, here, let's make a better drawing than that. Undo that. Let's do this. So here's your femur. Here's your patella. Here's your tibia. And your patella is attached by a tendon here. That's such a terrible drawing. It's too small. Clear everything, clear all the drawings. Let's think about a better way to draw this. Let's think. A better way to draw. All right, so I'll just draw your quad. This is your quadricep. And then you have your quadricep tendon. And your quadricep tendon is eventually going to turn into your patella. And then your patella is going to be attached by your patella tendon to your tibial tuberosity. And maybe what I'll do is I'll draw it in a different color, the bones, so you can see what I'm talking about. So this is a bone here. The femur is going to be here. And this is your tibia. And on your tibia is going to be a little bump here called your tibial tuberosity. You can feel it underneath your kneecap. So what happens is this patellar tendon is attached to the patella, and the patella is attached to the quadricep. So when the doctor bangs on your patellar tendon right here, what it does is it changes the length of the patellar tendon. You could imagine if I had a tendon like this, and I pushed down on the tendon right here, eventually what would happen because of the pressure is the tendon would go like this, and there would be like a dip in the tendon, right? Because I'm pushing down on the tendon. But that dip in the tendon is going to elongate the tendon. The tendon's going to get longer. And if the tendon gets longer and I pull the tendon in like this direction, what's going to happen is that's going to pull on the blue muscle, and it's going to elongate the muscle. But in the muscle, on one of these little muscle fibers, all right, if I take the muscle fiber out, it looks like this. Then wrapped around the muscle fiber are these little things called muscle spindles. And when the muscle fiber elongates and gets longer, it's going to take the spindle that's wrapped around the muscle fiber and also elongate the spindle like it's a spring. And that elongation is going to send information from the muscle back to the spinal cord. And it says, oh my God, when you hit this tendon here, even though the change in length is very small, it happens very rapidly. It changes the length of the muscle. Even if the muscle's length changes very little, the rate of length is very quick. You take a hammer and you go like this, bang, right on that spot. It changes the length of the muscle, and that muscle spindle is sensitive to that muscle change in length. So the muscle spindle sends information from the muscle to the spinal cord, all right, to the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord sends information directly back to the muscle without having to go to the brain. It sends the information directly back to the muscle. Now, if the muscle spindle is sensitive to muscle length, all right, when the muscle is elongated very quickly, the muscle spindle, very hierarchical phrase here, the muscle spindle thinks that the muscle is going to rip, right? Even if the change in length is very, very small, it happens at such a rate, such a high velocity when the doctor bangs that tendon, that the tendon elongates and it pulls the muscle, and the spindle on the muscle fiber sends that information to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord is going to send information back to the muscle. Now, the reason why your leg kicks is when I change the length of the patellar tendon, that in turn elongates the muscle, and then the muscle thinks it's going to tear. The muscle spindle sends a signal to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord sends a signal back to the muscle to clench up. Because if the muscle is elongating, it could tear. So the muscle tightens up. It contracts. It contracts to try to make it so that the muscle can't stretch anymore. And when the muscle contracts, it pulls on the patellar, it pulls on the patellar tendon, and it results in the lower leg extending. So that doctor is manipulating your muscle spindles and seeing whether or not the integrity of your feedback loop to your spinal cord is strong. A Golgi tendon organ is somewhat similar, but it's not in the muscle, it's in the tendon. So let me erase these, let's clear all this. So you have a Golgi tendon organ. Let's do this. Here's your humerus. Here's your elbow. And this is going to be your bicep. And this is your tendon. All right, now, if a Golgi tendon organ is sensitive to the tension in a tendon, right? Now, if your tendon is going to rip because you're lifting a barbell that's really heavy, the barbell is taking your lower arm and trying to pull your lower arm downwards like that. And that's putting a huge amount of tension on your tendon here, on your bicep tendon. And in the bicep tendon, you have these organs that are sensitive to tension. So if the bicep tendon is experiencing a huge amount of tension, it's afraid that it could tear. So if the bicep tendon is going to tear and the Golgi tendon is sensitive to tension, then the Golgi tendon organ is going to send information back to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord is going to send information back to the muscle, and it's going to tell the muscle to relax. If there's too much tension in the tendon and the tendon is going to rupture, then the tendon tells the muscle via the Golgi tendon organs to stop contracting. And if the muscle stops contracting, then that relieves the tension on the tendon. So they work kind of opposite to each other. But one cool thing about these Golgi tendon organs is this. Let's say I'm doing stretching. I stretch my guys, right, in the gym. And remember, when you're stretching someone, you're not just stretching the muscle. It's called the neuromuscular system. Neuromuscular. So when I'm stretching the guys in the gym, it used to be the case that what I tried to do is I stretched their muscles by having them do splits or having them do bridges or hang with their arms behind their back from the bars. And I focused so much on the muscles. Now what I do is I focus a lot more on the neurons, the neural part of flexibility. And I know I can manipulate the tension in a muscle by manipulating the Golgi tendon organs instead. So instead of doing bicep stretches, what I do is find the bicep tendon. And what I do is I put light pressure on the bicep tendon, because the bicep tendon is sensitive to tension. And if I put a light tension on the bicep tendon where the Golgi tendon organs are, then I'm making that mechanical signal to the spinal cord. And what the spinal cord is going to do is send a signal back to the muscle. And that signal back to the muscle is going to relax the muscle body to relieve the tension of the muscle tendinous unit that's functioning together. So I don't even stretch the muscle anymore. What I'll do is I'll find the bicep tendon and I'll just put pressure on the bicep tendon for 30 seconds. And the actual pressure of the bicep tendon is going to result in a reciprocal relaxation of the bicep itself. So I'm manipulating the neurons and the Golgi tendon organs to make it so that the muscles are far less stiff. But it's not just do a split or do a bridge or pull on it if it's, if to stretch, like I can manipulate all of these things to result in whatever muscular result or whatever reduction in stiffness that I want. I do the same thing with pecs. You know, like obviously, like when you're doing bench press, your pecs get super sore. So what I do is I trace all the way back to the insertion point of the pectoralis major on the humerus. And then what I do is I just manipulate those tendons, pressure on the tendons, and then it relaxes using Golgi tendon organs. It relaxes the muscles. And then afterwards, and so instead of giving deep tissue massage to my guys, what I'll do is I'll just put tension on their pectoralis major muscle, or I'll put tension on their bicep tendon, or tension on their quad tendon, or their tibial tuberosity. It's called an ischemic trigger release. What you're doing is you're finding the point of kind of tension on that tendon that causes a little bit of discomfort, and then you back off. And then what you're doing is you're retraining the body to not send this signal. You don't have to. Right now, my guys in the gym are sometimes so stiff and so tight that, like, say for instance, their Achilles tendons or their calves are so tight that what's happening is their calves are so close to tearing that they're always in pain. Usually pain, that sensation of pain, is an indicator that there's potential for injury. So what I do is I'll push on the tendon, I'll push on the bicep tendon, and I'll ask, does it hurt? No, it doesn't hurt. Okay, so I push a little bit more to the point where maybe it's a little bit discomforting, and then I back off a little bit. Now, usually when this tendon is stretched, it's as a result of doing physical activity, and the tendon thinks that the muscle could get injured. But now when I'm just pushing with my finger, there's no potential for injury. And then the neurons of that particular muscle fiber and the Golgi tendon organs, they'll kind of like almost learn that this pressure isn't going to cause injury. And what I can do is I can shut off the pain sensation. My guys will come in, we'll do bicep curls. They'll come in the next day, they'll say, oh my God, my biceps are sore. Now that could be because there's micro damage because of the intensity of the weight. Anyway, they say, how do I stretch my biceps? And I'll say, well, let's not stretch your biceps at all. Just give me your arm. And I put pressure on their bicep tendon for 30 seconds. Then I release the tension of their bicep tendon, and they say, wow, my muscle feels much better. And all you're doing is you're retraining the muscle that the tension that you're putting on it isn't going to result in injury. So after a little while, your muscle isn't going to be sending such a harsh pain signal. It's the same thing as the Babinski test that we talked about a couple of classes ago with the baby that gets the foot pricked. At first, the baby's going to pull its foot away because it doesn't want that uncomfortableness. But if you keep pricking the foot, then the baby learns that the pricking of the foot isn't going to cause injury. I don't need to pull my foot away. And after a couple of times, the baby stops pulling the foot away. Because what you're doing is you're manipulating the neurons. So when I stretch the kids in the gym, I actually have transitioned from stretching the muscle to stretching the kinesthetic receptors in the joint, to stretching the muscle spindles and stretching Golgi tendon organs. Right? I manipulate the Golgi tendon organs to relieve the tension in the muscle. Right? So I'm just treating the whole thing as a system. If I'm doing flexibility, I could stretch the muscle. Yeah, you're right. But I can also work on the neural aspect of the muscle, and all muscles are attached to neurons. So how do I manipulate the neurons to get the muscle to be less stiff? That's been my new way of stretching. Anybody have any questions or anything like that? I know it's a lot of stuff, but if you have any questions, stop me. All right, let's go. Let's clear this stuff and go to the next slide. So your motor division, or the information coming from your brain to your um, arms and legs, has two divisions. There's the autonomic, which is automatic things that are regulating the activity of your organs, like your heart rate, your breathing rate, vasodilation, vasoconstriction. All of that stuff happens automatically, and that is regulated by your autonomic nervous system. Your somatic nervous system is all skeletal muscle activity. The motor division is transferring information to affect both of these. The autonomic nervous system controls all of the functioning of your organs that you're not thinking of right now. All of the peristalsis, digestion, the release of insulin from your pancreas, all of that stuff. Increases in heart rate, blood pressure during exercise is all autonomic nervous system. There is the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system that are part of this autonomic nervous system here. You could think of the sympathetic nervous system is whatever needs to be done so you can get out of trouble, right? So you're going to either have to run really fast or you're going to have to kill whatever's next to you. So your sympathetic nervous system is going to make it so that you get more oxygen, more fuel, more blood, more air, increase metabolism, increase your awareness. And your parasympathetic nervous system, remember the P has the part that goes down. That's how I remember it. The P pushes everything down. Whoops, that's kind of weird, but the P part of the letter goes downwards. So that helps me remind me that the parasympathetic is rest and digest, right? Rest is what you do. Rest is lack of exercise, and digest is like the eating food part, right? That's what the lion does after it eats the food. It rests and digests. That's what you do at the end of your Thanksgiving meal. You're resting and digesting. So the things that trigger this parasympathetic stimulation are when you put food in your body. All right. If you're trying to conserve energy, if you're trying to conserve your heart rate. And part of the parasympathetic function is to increase digestion, especially of not of carbohydrate, but more of fat, right? If you're trying to run away from something, you need to have a good amount of sugars and free fatty acids. So what the sympathetic nervous system does is it releases glucose from adipose tissue. It releases free fatty acids from adipose tissues. It increases the glucose levels by gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis, taking glycogen and switching it back so you can utilize it for fuel. Let's see here. The sympathetic effects of your heart muscle are to increase heart rate and the force of contraction so you can squeeze more blood out of the heart, get more oxygen and fuel to the muscles. The coronary blood vessels, the vessels within the heart, they all get bigger, right? The sympathetic effects is to cause vasoconstriction. If the heart blood vessels constrict, then what it's going to do is it's going to increase, if I look at the digestive system, increase relaxation, increase blood flow to the stomach, increases blood flow to, I would bet, your digestive system. So all of these effects of the sympathetic nervous system are designed to keep you safe when you're increasing heat, increase sweating, increase lipolysis. Lipo is fat. Lysis is the breaking of fat. So your sympathetic nervous system is going to start to make it so that you can use fat for fuel, because it's assuming you're going to be running. And if you're running, you're going to be using all of your glucose. So it starts to get your body ready to not have enough glucose. All right, so these are all of the changes that occur in each of these organs given the changes to the sympathetic or your parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, where are we at here? Okay, so what this is saying is when you have a sensation, you'll notice here the sensation here is a pain prick. There's a stimulus, all right? There's a sensory receptor underneath the stimulus, all right? There's this yellow sensory receptor. The stimulus comes in, it triggers the mechanical receptor or the baroreceptor, or this, instead of a pinprick, this could be somebody spilled acid on my hand. This could be a hot, like somebody takes a spatula that's really hot, and then in that case, it would be a knock-receptor or whatever. So you have these different sensories are going to be transmitted along the sensory neuron to the either to the brain or to the spinal cord, and that either the brain is going to send through an alpha motor neuron, it's going to send information back to the muscle that so that a fiber can contract, an action potential can be propagated, and a movement can occur. All right, so
sensory motor integration begins when a sensory stimulus is received by a sensory receptor, in this case, a pinprick to the skin. The sensory action potential is transmitted along sensory neurons to the central nervous system. The central nervous system interprets the information and determines the motor response, or reflexively initiates a motor response.
I mean, that's also very top down. It says the sensory motor, right? Just the phrases, the central nervous system interprets the information. Right, but in this case, the information came in as a pinprick. It came in as pain. And now the central nervous system is going to have to transfer that information, which is coming in as pain information, and it's going to have to interpret that pain information and switch the pain information to some type of action potential. And how does it know to do that? How does it do it so fast? Right, if the information comes in,
interprets the information, and
so one key thing about this phrase here is information. When you're talking about the brain and you're talking about motor control and things like that, and you're in your dissertation or you're trying to defend your thesis, don't use the word information, because information is not really clear. Like, so is the central nervous system interpreting the information as words? Is it as zeros and ones? Is it binary? Is it interpreting the information in English? Is it interpreting the information in chemicals? Is the information clear? Does the brain, how long is the information? Information is a loaded term. It implies not only does the information have to be transmitted, but the information has to be read. And if it's going to be read, it has to have a language to it. So how does the pinprick result in a language or an information that the brain can understand? And then how does the brain, it says the central nervous system interprets the information. Rather than saying the central nervous system interprets the information, dynamic systems theory would say the pinprick results in some type of emergent something or other that allows for something or other to emerge, that allows for something other to emerge. Not saying that that answers any question at all. But again, it's saying that the central nervous system is doing this function here. And if I just put a central nervous system on a table, it won't do anything. So I don't know how to get around that phrase, but I'll just press play and listen, because again, I'm going through the whole course with the assumption that I believe that the central nervous system and the brain is interpreting all that information.
Interprets the information and determines the motor response, or reflexively initiates a motor response. The motor action potential travels out from the central nervous system through motor neurons. The action potential reaches the muscle fibers and the response occurs. In this case, muscle contraction, pulling the body part away from the painful stimulus.
All right, and now what this is saying is that the sensory input is not necessarily only interpreted by the central nervous system. So in the case of the doctor banging the patellar tendon, that information goes from your Golgi tendon organ, it goes into the muscle spindles, and then the information goes right to the spinal cord and then back to the muscle. It doesn't need, that information is reflexive. It's a reflex. It's not something that needs to be cognitively understood. So the information from the muscle, in the case that the doctor bangs your patellar tendon, that's integrated and processed at the spinal cord. But there are other there's other sensory information that is more complex and needs to go higher and higher up the central nervous system to be dealt with. And then this sensory input, like I said before, can result in some type of movement, regardless of where the information is integrated or is broken down. For instance, if you have your muscle here and you have your muscle fiber and the Golgi, the muscle spindle is around the muscle fiber, and that muscle spindle is going to be linked to the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is obviously at the vertebrae. And then you have the spinal cord goes in between. Like that. Well, the information from the muscle spindle leaves the muscle fiber. It goes to the spinal cord. Then the spinal, that's kind of like a reflexive sensation. The doctor comes and bangs on your tendon, it immediately pulls on your muscle spindle and elongates it. That stimulus there is very simple stimulus. It doesn't need to be interpreted by the brain. It's just a change in length. So that stimulus gets to the spinal cord, and what the spinal cord does is it sends a signal directly back to the muscle, and it innervates the muscle in a number of different motor, a number of different muscle fibers. And if the muscle spindle is elongating and doesn't want to tear, then the signal, the elongating signal, is sent to the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord sends a signal back to the muscle to relax. So that's sensory input that is not going to the higher central nervous system, that is resulting in some type of motor response, some type of movement. And it doesn't matter where that particular information stops, whether or not it stops at the spinal cord or goes all the way up to the brain. Each one of these regions here can result in some type of movement or motor response. And those responses that don't require too much of the brain, those are what we usually call reflexes. Right? A reflex is a response that's there to potentially reduce injury or pain or a problem. So it seems to be very instantaneous. Now, this is a pre-programmed response. This is another word like programmed. Programmed in what? Like some type of like computer language? And where is the program stored? It's not stored necessarily anywhere. It's almost as bad as using the word information, right? It is instant though. And instead of thinking about pre-programmed, or what I like to use is that word, the term emergent. It is instant. And an emergent property emerges instantaneously. And that's kind of interesting to me. How can a movement be instant if the brain is programming? Well, the way that they say, well, the brain isn't now programming. The brain isn't sending the signal. The brain, it's pre-programmed, Alexandra. So not only does the brain get to program stuff, but it has other stuff that's pre-programmed, you know, like rewritten. But like that movement that I did, or if somebody like shoots an arrow at me and I like dodge it like that, that's not pre-programmed. I've never been shot at with an arrow before, so there's no pre-program. But it is easy for me to think that it emerges. It emerges because I have a ballistic flying at me. I have another system of moving parts that needs to move out of the way. And what emerges is the reflex. So it is instant, but I don't think it's pre-programmed, because if it is pre-programmed, then you have to explain what programming language is it pre-programmed in? HTML? Sodium potassium ion channels? Okay, one of it's, but if you're telling me it's programmed in some language. If there's information, okay, I get you, but what form is the information in? And if the information comes in as light and then eventually goes out as movement, where did the translation between light information and movement come from? Right, so information, programming, schemata, there's all these terms that people, generalized motor program, a GMP, you'll hear about that in motor programming kind of like discussions. I think that this motor reflex is more of an instantaneous emergent action as opposed to a pre-programmed action. And we also talked about things like reflexes. Like, I don't even know what a reflex is anymore. If I'm gonna go and grab my phone, and that's a cognitive action. But when I go reach for that cognitive action, there's a reflex that occurs, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, to keep my body upright. So is the reflex now something that is thought of or not thought of, or is it conscious? Because if I'm going to go reach for my coffee cup, that's conscious. But part of that conscious movement towards the coffee cup is an unconscious stabilization of my lower back. So is that movement that I'm thinking of, is it also reflect like a reflex? And then where does the bridge between conscious awareness and unconscious awareness happen? Or, I mean, it's easy to say, what did it say earlier? It said that I think the thalamus does all that stuff, right? Right. So the thalamus determines what we are consciously aware of. This thing in our brain is the one part of your brain that apparently is regulating whether or not a reflex should occur, because it's my thalamus that I had to tell you was in charge of this conscious awareness. So how could a reflex occur before conscious awareness, or before the brain does anything, if the thalamus is the thing that is determining conscious awareness? You know what I mean? Like, it can't occur before conscious awareness, and it can't be a non-brain pre-programmed response if the brain is determining the conscious awareness of things. So they use terms that are kind of easy to use, but when you think about them, it doesn't really add up. And I'll tell you, there is a difference between this, all right? This is a description, to describe, and an explanation. There's a difference between describing something and explaining something. Now, I think that the hierarchical motor programming theory is a very easy way to describe how the human body is organized, or how the brain or motor control happens. It's a good description, but not a good explanation. For instance, okay, let's say I draw this little leaf here. I'm going to draw a leaf. Erase. Not going to draw a leaf. It's too difficult. I'm going to draw a box. Box, easier. Now the box is here. And eventually, I want the box to be over here. So I could imagine the box travels over there, and now the box used to be here, and now the box is over here. All right, well, I'm going to describe the motion of this box, Alice. I want you to tell me if I'm incorrect at the description of this box. It is as if the box moved from one side of the screen to the other, as if it was on a wind-swept leaf.
No.
Whoa. I'm just being poetic. I'm just saying, I'm describing it as if the box was on a breeze, and the breeze just moved the box from one side to the other. I could also describe it, Alice, as if the box was on a conveyor belt. All right, the box went from here to there. It went from here to there. And if I put it on a conveyor belt, likewise, it would have gone from here to there. I could also say, Alice, it's kind of like the box was surfing, because when you surf, you go from here to there. Or I could say, Alice, it's almost as if the box was in its little teeny clown car and drove from here to there. Or I could say, wow, it almost moved like that box was being blown by the wind, or it was just like it was on, but that's not how I could explain how the box went from there to there. I can describe things any way that I want. I can describe it as if it was on a boat, as if it was on a canoe, as if it was a rower on the Charles, for it went from here to there. But I cannot explain how the box went from there to there. Using any of those, I would have to say, actually, the box didn't go from there to there. It's just a picture of a box that can be erased. You know, it's just a picture. It's the explanation that I would give to you is, actually, Alice, the box didn't move at all. It's two different boxes, right? And it's just lines that are there to, that's the explanation of how this happened. Now, saying that the brain is this marionette top, let's erase this. Saying that the brain is this part of the marionette, this top part, and the neurons are the lines, you know, or the ropes from the marionette. They all come down here, and these are all my neurons and stuff. And then those things are all attached to the arm, the head, the elbow, the wrist, and this is how the body works. This is a hierarchical motor programming description of the body, but it's not a good explanation. And it's not a good explanation because where does stuff like this come from? And how does conscious awareness not include the brain if the thalamus is the thing that's determining our conscious awareness? In the description, and notice here, sensory, motor, and what is this thing implying? What does that imply? It implies that they're not separate. It implies they're a system, a sensory motor system, like I was talking about before, the systems theory. And then you see all throughout it, there's competing theories in the same book, and they're all thrown at you because they're catchphrases: action potential, sliding filament theory, the brain, conscious awareness, the mind, the this, the that. But within the same context of the book, they're throwing different theories at you, but you're just not aware of it. So you can't determine when one theory ends and one theory breaks down. Right? What the book to me is doing is it's describing motor control using this top-down theory. It's even going through each of the chapters. It started with the brain, then it goes to the brain stem, then the spinal cord, and then it works its way all the way back up through the afferent nerves. Right? The explanation of human movement is way more complicated because we do things instantaneously. And Flips is able to do things, and he's able to anticipate where another person is going to be in 10 seconds. That person is running completely randomly. And Flips has no idea where this person is going to be. And he needs to make instantaneous movements that he could never, ever anticipate. Like, no route that Flips has ever run has been the same as any other route that he's ever run before. Even though the play might be the same, it's the field is different. His strength, his hydration levels are different. His flexibility, where the other people are on the field is different. The noise of the crowd, the winning, the state of the game, everything is always in flux. So to say that Flips has these pre-programmed responses and he's running down the field and then another computer program slides out, it slides into his motor control, and that's how everything happens. It's too crazy to think of the brain doing everything. So what you're going to have to do over the next 10 years of your lives as you go into your doctoral programs and you become athletic trainers and help people, you're going to have to come up with a way of explaining instantaneousness to people. How we can move instantly. And it seeming like it's a pre-programmed response. Seemingly like the brain is controlling the body. Seeming as though you have conscious awareness of everything that you're doing, but to be 100% honest, I don't think Flips has ever considered one time his velocity, right? The angle at which he's running, his acceleration. I don't think he's ever considered so many of these different variables. The only way for me to explain movement to you now, to explain where movement comes from, is not by using this or this. It's by admitting that my theory is truly theoretical, dynamic systems theory. But if I have one point and I connect that other point to it with a line, and I just make a system, now all of a sudden there's length. Where length came from, I have no idea. How the universe got set up so that systems have emergent properties, I have no idea. But I can use that to explain the instantaneous nature of not only movement, but vision and hearing. Like, you close your eyes, Alexandra's tarp behind her, that little thing. If you look how many shapes there are, there's got to be a million different textural cues that you look at in that, in the what is that blanket behind her on the wall. But I can, over my zoom, I can see them all instantaneously, and all of the strands of her hair instantaneously. Instantaneous movement is something you're going to need to consider. And if your theory is the brain does it, fine, but you're going to need to explain how the brain can do things instantaneously that are seemingly pre-programmed, because they're doing things like, you have a little baby All right. Yeah, I'm gonna shut that somebody's mowing some stuff. The lawn. Give me a sec. Hey, quiet down out there, huh? That should work. We'll see if that goes. See if that works. Just kidding. I just shut the door. That was just a joke. All right. So you're going to have to explain how instantaneous things happen in your theory of motor control. And after like the first 5 years of my doctoral program, I couldn't do it. I had no idea. And then one day I went into my doctoral advisor. I was like, are you guys telling me that the brain doesn't do everything? And he was like, yeah, that's what we're saying. And I was like, but we've been taught the brain is like a computer. Why are you described things as opposed to explain them? It's way easier to describe things. I can say the brain's like a computer. Everybody knows what a computer is. It's easy to conceptualize. So 95% of the population is going to be okay with the description. Here's another description. The eye is like a camera. Raise your hand if you heard that one. Right, but the eye is not like a camera. You watch Jurassic Park, right? Vision is based on movement. Cameras don't work well when they move. They're like the opposite of each other. But if I tell you that the eye is like a camera because it's got a lens, all right, I mean, a good portion of the population is going to be okay with that. Right, so to me, all of a sudden in my doctoral program, when you guys go get your master's degrees, you're going to all of a sudden run into problems. And the problem is that for a long time, you've been described how all of this stuff works. And you buy into it. I bought into it for a long time. But now you're going to have to explain it to people. And I don't know how to explain stuff without using dynamic systems theory for sure. Otherwise, why don't I just say exercise physiology, day one, the brain does it all. You know what I mean? That's the easiest way to explain it, if that's really what's happening, but that's not what's happening. What's happening is we've gone over for the last three weeks, all of these different systems, neuromuscular, neuroendocrine, cardiovascular, musculoskeletal, and they all say system. So it frees you up to say, hey, maybe this guy's actually saying something that's interesting. So this is what really got me going. And we only have, I think, two more slides. So we have this muscle spindle slide. We already talked about that. All right. I was just talking about the Golgi tendon organs, exactly what I was talking about before, right? Right. When stimulated by excessive tension, the Golgi tendon, it makes it so that it relaxes, it inhibits the agonist. To inhibit something means to stop it. It stops the main muscle and it excites the antagonist. So like, for instance, if my bicep tendon I want to work on somebody's bicep tendon because it's sore, then I would push, or their bicep muscle, because their bicep muscle is sore, what I would do is I would stimulate the Golgi tendon organ by pushing on it, by making tension to the point where it's excessive. And then the kid's like, oh man, that's a little bit sore to my muscle. I said, all right, back off a little bit. What that's going to do is it's going to stop my bicep from firing, and it's going to excite my tricep, which is going to relieve even more tension off of my bicep tendon. So I coach and I do my flexibility, but I don't do splits anymore. I don't do bridges anymore. What I do is I do deep tissue massage and I manipulate the Golgi tendon organs to allow for the muscle to relax naturally. And what that does is it reduces potential for injury because the muscle is less stiff. Then once we do deep tissue massage and then they do a little bit of flexibility, it seems to go much better. But I'm specifically manipulating the sensory motor integration. This is what the doctor is doing when he's banging you in the knee, right? This one here, muscle spindles. And this is what I do when I'm stretching. This is also what you're trying to tap into when you're doing plyometrics, right? The stretching and the relaxation of the tendon to inhibit and excite musculature. And that's what the whole basis of plyometric exercise is. And then that's pretty much the entire lecture. Let's see what time it is right now, because I do have one other thing that I want to do. Does anybody have any other questions? You got to find your own explanations of things. It's super easy to describe everything because, you know, and then if you describe things to 95% of the population, most people are going to be all right with it. But it's the people on this call who are going to question. That's why you're on this call. That's why you're at school, is because you're here trying to learn, trying to not buy into everything. Like, why do I know that Medusa has snakes for hair? Why do I know that? But I don't know necessarily how the brain functions, or I don't. Does anybody here know that there's more than one kind of walking? Humans walk in many different fashions. Has anybody ever been taught that? And if not, why? You know what I mean? When you walk really slow, both arms tick together. And as you get faster and faster, your arms start to go opposite. And if you go a little bit faster and a little bit faster, what happens is your trunk and your pelvis start to go opposite of each other. And then you start to move your pelvis so that you can get a bigger walking stride. And then what you do is you switch to on your toe walking so you can use your Achilles tendon. And sometimes when I'm walking barefoot in my apartment, I do that like toe walking. I don't know if anybody else does that, but I like only walk on the fronts of my feet. Like, why? Why aren't we taught all of these interesting things about our own physiology? We're taught other things that I think are there, like there's a key on a kite string. All right, dude, but like, how does the body move, you know? So I would encourage you to think for yourselves, because at some point you're going to have to explain all of this. I'm on a computer call with you guys and you're trusting me to be your professor. And what you're doing is you're entrusting me to not describe everything to you. That's not my job. My job is to explain things to you, you know, and that's different. So the way that I choose to do this, I could say, yeah, the brain does everything. It sends the information. Yeah. It's electricity. It just does the thing, you know? Or I could choose to say, wow, man, I was electrified in my doctorate by people who started to explain things differently. So like, you know, you're walking down the street, or you're going up a hill, right? And where does the decision, like if you're walking up a hill, the hill is here, you're walking up the hill and then the down the hill part. When you're walking uphill, you need to lean forward. Otherwise, you'll fall backwards. But when you're walking downhill, the opposite is true. You gotta need to lean backwards, because if you don't, you'll fall forward. Has anybody ever thought of that before? Anybody ever consciously thought of that? And if you have, it's interesting. I've never have. But if you have, like, what degree? Is this like 10 degrees here? Is this a 10-degree lean? What theta are you leaning at here? Anybody ever thought of that? Anybody ever felt like they're driving down the road? They're listening to Taylor Swift, Lover, loving that song. It's good stuff. Locke stepped on it. And then 3 minutes later, you're like, oh my God, I don't even remember driving. I was just kind of like paying attention, but I'm not thinking about it. How do you drive without thinking about it? You know what I mean? So to me, the easiest way to explain those things to you is to explain it as opposed to describe it. Where these angles seem to come out of nowhere, they emerge out of nowhere. Now, they're not out of nowhere, All right. You have a thing going on that we take for granted, which is gravity. We're always on the earth. So the earth is a system itself, and the earth has gravity. So you have, like, let's say you have this dynamic system thing that we're putting together. And right here, this is earth. This is the point that we call earth in this system that we're creating. Now you have another thing over here, another system, which we call a person. But there's other systems that are interacting with this earth and person. But like, what is the emergent property of an earth person system? That's kind of weird. Never really thought of that. Right? It's the ability to life. It's organisms having oxygen and carbohydrates so that they can make ATP. That's probably the emergent property of an earth person system. But that earth, which is like the global thing, like think about gravity, the atmosphere. You also have another thing like right here, right? This road, this topography is a system. It's a hard surface that affords walking. It has angles, right? It's just a system of what the road is. And the road, or the path taken, is in this direction. It goes in this direction along that line. This direction, he's walking in this direction. So this here is the path taken, and it's the road that he's traveling. And you could think of that as another node of this system, which we'll call this the road. And what emerges from the Earth's gravity system interacting with a person that is pendulums and a walking, multi-limbed pendulum. So your body is shaped like pendulums. That's why it walks like pendulums. So your body is this system of levers and joints and muscle walking in this environment that has gravity. And you're also interacting with this road. And I can complete the system because the road is also in this earth and connect everything. And what emerges from the unique structuring of the earth and the person and the road is the path, or the way that you walk up and down the road. It emerges. If you had a different road, you'd have a different style of walking. But I don't think of the style of walking when I do it. It's just that what would happen if I didn't lean forward here? Well, if I didn't lean forward, what would happen is I would fall backwards. And then this pocket of energy that is me would die, or would get injured, or would dissipate. So the path that you take is an emergent property of all the systems that are interacting. And now in dynamic systems theory, I think that one of the things that's important to maybe, like, this is the overarching, I guess, reason that everything goes in the dynamic systems theory is because energy wants to keep going. It doesn't want to be dissipated. And remember, like, you can't get rid of energy. It's only transferred, right? But it doesn't want to die. It wants to keep going. So if this is the overall tenet of what energy does, energy just wants to be. So why would I lean forward? Because if I don't lean forward, my pocket of energy is going to fall backwards, and it's not going to be for as long as it could be. It'll be injured and it'll break down and eventually it'll die. Why do I get food? Because same reason. Why do I lean forward? Why do I avoid guardrails? Why do I avoid, you're driving down the street, all right? And you have a really simple system that you're creating when you're driving down the street. There's not too many things that make up the system, all right? There's one point, it's a car, all right? The car has wheels and, hold on one second. one point is the car. The other point is the person driving the car. The other point is gravity. And then you have another point over here, which is the rules of the road. And the rules of the road aren't complicated. You got lines you got to stay in front of. And if you see red lights, you got to either stop or steer. You think about it, that's pretty simple rules that whole system is structured by. This is the rules of the road. This is the rules of the person. This is the rules of the car. And this is the rules of the earth, and the rules of the road have their nuances to it. The rules of the earth has gravity. The rules of the car has its torque, its speed, how fast it goes, how many people can be in the car, just the characteristics of the car. The road has its characteristics. It has its undulations. It has whether or not there's lights. It has whether or not there's other cars. These are all just kind of nodes in the variables that make up this road situation. But in any event, when the road and the car and the earth and the person all link up, there's another system that's created. It's the car, road, person, earth system. And what emerges from that system in dynamic systems theory is the path taken. So the person doesn't have to know the path taken. The path taken isn't coming from the brain. The path taken isn't coming from the car, although with smart cars, it actually is the case that this path can now be taken without the person. So now it's not the person's brain doing it at all. You can't explain when my brother drives his Tesla to Connecticut. I can no longer explain it by saying that my brother uses his brain to drive the car, because he doesn't. So I think that, how does this happen? I don't know. How did dynamic systems theory happen? I don't know. That's why it's theoretical, but I can explain to you instantaneous movement. I can explain to you how flips is able to catch the ball, because right now you have this system. It's flips, it's the other catcher, and it's the rules of football. And it's earth again. Earth is always there, right? And now you have flips and you have the rules of football functioning on the earth and you have him as a person and the rules of engagement of the game. And this is the other person that flip is trying to catch up to. And what emerges from that system is where flips needs to be at any moment. But that's not the thalamus being in control of all conscious movement. That's the easier way for me to explain it is it's not the brain doing any of this, but the brain is functioning within it, just like the heart, just like the lungs, just like everything else. But it's a cog in the wheel. It's just another system. This is the brain. This is the cardiovascular system. This is the neuroendocrine system. This is your lymph system. This is your liver system. And then what emerges from that is life. How that happens, I have no idea. Not sure at all. But I can use dynamic systems theory to explain things much easier than I can use just hierarchical motor programming theory, and the brain does it to explain it. So that's where I would go today. Does anybody have any questions? But we're not done yet. We still have a couple more minutes, may as well. I'm going to share with you guys a link, but you'll have to give me a second. I'm going to stop this. Now, one of the cool things about kind of riffing and giving you guys my experience is you could read the book as much as you want, but you're not going to get the push in the direction towards thinking for yourself unless you have an interaction with somebody who like myself, who's been through some of this stuff. So watch the YouTube videos. That's where you should get a lot of the information that you need. But what I can do is I can adjunct that by giving you information that I got above and beyond the description that is offered in a textbook.